evening. My name is Louise Richardson. I'd like to welcome you all to the forum this evening. We're delighted to have two fascinating speakers to address an issue of our times. The topic of this evening's discussion will be Northern Ireland, the prospects for a resolution of the conflict. We have two speakers who will each speak briefly, 10 or 15 minutes, to give you all lots of time for questions. Our first speaker will be Mr. Billy Hutchinson, who is press officer and executive member of the Progressive Unionist Party. Mr. Hutchinson grew up on the Shankill Road in Belfast and became active in the Ulster Volunteer Force, a loyalist paramilitary organisation. In 1974, he received a life sentence for loyalist paramilitary activities. He served 16 years in prison, where he earned a BA in social science and acted as senior spokesman with government officials. He is now the project director of Springfield Inter-Community Development Project, which is a cross-community project on the Peace Line in West Belfast. He is involved in a number of community programs, from the Housing Association to the youth training programs. And as anyone who has been on the ground in Belfast recently, he has been a force for peace at recent times in Belfast. Mr. Alex Atwood is a member of the Social Democratic and Labour Party. He has been a member of the Belfast City Council since 1985. He is a graduate of Queen's University in Belfast and is a lawyer by profession, though I've assured him we won't hold that against him. He served as a representative to the Forum on Peace and Reconciliation in 1994 and is currently a delegate to the multi-party talks which have been taking place under the chairmanship of Senator George Mitchell. His particular interests include policing and human rights issues. Now, while both of our speakers tonight represent two different perspectives on events in Northern Ireland, I have learned in the course of the evening that they have a great deal in common. First of all, they both represent an area in Belfast which has the highest unemployment of any area in Britain, official unemployment rates of over 30%. And they both come from an area in West and North Belfast which has seen 2/3 of all the recent political violence in Northern Ireland. And finally, they have in common the fact that they both completed the Boston Marathon last year. So I'd like you to welcome them both, and we will open for questions as soon as they have had their comments. So first, Mr. Hutchinson.
First of all, I would like to say how great an honour it is to be here. I think this is my third occasion of being at the Kennedy School. I came here back in October '94, just after the two ceasefires that were announced in Northern Ireland. And I was here last year for a week when I spent a week here in the school with other political parties from Northern Ireland, examining what was happening around the rest of the world and trying to learn. And it was a very positive experience. So I'm glad to be here tonight. Northern Ireland, the prospects for a resolution of the conflict. I would want to start off with a quotation from Martin Luther King, and that is, "True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice." And I think that's what we must strive for in Northern Ireland to achieve. We must try and achieve justice in our society, and it must be present in all aspects of our lives, irrespective of religion, race, gender, or disability. We must build a society that is pluralist, that is free from fear of persecution, and where people are judged for their human worth and not for their religious or political ideology. Now I would want to address a question. I would take issue with the title, Northern Ireland, the prospects for a resolution of the conflict. My reason for doing so is based on the assumption that there are not any apparent prospects for resolution of our conflict. In fact, I would argue that the centuries-old conflict, and you will notice that I don't actually put a length of time on it, because in Northern Ireland, depending on whether you're British or Irish, you always say how long the conflict is. If you say it's 800 years, then everybody knows that you're Irish. And if you say that it's only been 70 years, then people automatically know that you're British. Seriously though, I believe that a resolution of the conflict would be impossible, because both sides are diametrically opposed. The armed conflict has been carried out by Irish Republicans on the one hand, who want a 32-county socialist republic, and on the other hand by Ulster loyalists, who want to remain within the United Kingdom. Irish Republicans are totally opposed to any involvement of the British in Ireland, and the Ulster Loyalists are totally opposed to the involvement of the Irish Republic. The armed conflict is casting a great shadow over Northern Ireland at this present time, and this threat of violence, we all have tried to find out why it has come about or who it has come from. In terms of the threat of violence, is it because Sinn Féin were not given entry to the talks? Is it due to the lack of progress at the talks? Is it a manifestation of Republican frustration at the pace which the peace process has moved? Or is it due to the stark reality that a united Ireland isn't imminent? All of these questions are serious questions, and I don't believe that I have the time here tonight in my speech to actually deal with them with the time that they actually deserve. But maybe when we come to the questions and answers, that we will be able to take some of these questions up and explore them further. There's also the question of, did the Republican movement realise that it couldn't achieve the pan-nationalist front? And did it realise that the diaspora are tired of the use of violence to achieve a united Ireland? Those are the things that I would want to try and examine later. One of the things that we must be sure about, and whenever all of those questions are analysed, is that any return to armed conflict by Republicans or by Loyalists must be reversed. The one thing that Republicans have come to realise is the fact that they are out of step with Irish nationalism on the question of the principle of consent. And this is the reason why we must ensure that there's no return to violence over this principle of consent. We must transform our conflict from one of armed conflict to one of non-violence. And again, I would want to quote Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "I am convinced that if we succumb to the temptation to use violence in our struggle for freedom, unborn generations will be recipients of a long and desolate night of bitterness, and our chief legacy to them will be a never-ending reign of chaos." I have seen this in the Loyalist community from which I come. 25 years ago, I fought alongside the fathers and grandfathers of the young Loyalists who are prepared to fight against the IRA today. In another 20 years, their unborn children will be willing to take up the fight. These young men are filled with hatred and fear. We must create a society that will attempt to eradicate that hatred and fear that touches all our lives. I know if Loyalists go back to violence, I will watch conveyor belts carrying young men to the prisons and to the cemeteries, just as they carried their fathers and grandfathers. I would imagine that the situation is no different in the Republican community, so the decision to continue with armed struggle is one that will condemn our society to the legacy of a never-ending reign of chaos described by Dr. King. The transformation of our conflict needs to be addressed on a number of levels. For instance, government and political parties, grassroots community, institutions such as the churches and the education institutions, and of course the men and women of the Loyalist and Republican paramilitaries. We must attack all of these levels if we hope to build an inclusive process, and not one that excludes everybody except the political parties. The political parties could reach decisions with more speed if there was a feeling of ownership in the community. The people need to feel they can participate in building the future. The process must belong to all the people and not one side. In terms of this transformation of the conflict that I would talk about, and about working at different levels to try and achieve that, I think I would like to explain a bit about that. I mean, in terms of government and political parties, there's a lot of things that need to be done. We have just watched the talks, which started on the 10th of June last year and ended last week. They were long, they were slow, and they were laborious, and there was very little progress made in those talks. I think that there would have been even less progress made if we hadn't had a chairman of the capability of Senator George Mitchell. And I think it's important that we try and look at what can be done in terms of moving this forward. It's about getting political parties to look and examine other things that are happening in other areas of the world where there's conflicts, and I think that we aren't exactly the same as South Africa or Nicaragua or Israel or Palestine, but there are examples there that can be used in terms of trying to resolve that conflict. Again, in terms of grassroots community, there are quite a lot of people who don't belong to political parties, but are involved in the community and have suffered from some of the worst violence. And those people have been able to use their influence in terms of holding the communities together and ensuring that things didn't get worse. So we actually need to work with those people as well and build up those relationships and ensure that political parties and the community groups are actually connecting and know about these relationships. There's the churches and the education institutions, and I think that quite a lot of people in Northern Ireland, particularly those people involved in political and community life, would be critical of the role that the churches have played over the last 27 years. I think that they have probably played a spiritual role and have refused to condemn things in a sense, or to talk out about things rather than condemn, but to talk out about things that shouldn't have been happening in their communities. And there's a lot of talk about what the churches should have done. So I think we need to build that relationship with the churches, and we need to encourage the churches to take more of a positive role. And I know that the four main church leaders visited here about 5 years ago, and I know when they came back that they were quite enthused about some of the things that they had learned here in America. Unfortunately, they weren't able to carry that forward, and now out of those four leaders who visited here, there's only one that still remains. So I think it's important that we do that. And of course, we've got educational institutions, and unlike Harvard or the Kennedy School of Government, I would feel, and our party would feel, that these people have not played their role. They have been given all sorts of donations from all around the world and have been made campuses of the United Nations, and they have looked at every conflict and they've examined every conflict in the world but our own. We're sitting on their doorstep, and they haven't came to interview people who have been involved in the conflict or to try and find out why the conflict happens. And they tend to sit in offices and read papers that are produced either by loyalist paramilitaries or Republican paramilitaries or by political parties. That isn't good enough. They have resources and they have people, and they should be doing the work on the ground that is being carried out by particularly American educational institutions. So, I think that they need to examine their role and ensure that they play a better role in the future. It's about getting all of those levels working together. There's also the important role of those people who are involved in loyalist and Republican paramilitaries. I think if we're going to move a peace process forward, we need to have people who can influence them. And I think that, I suppose, the end term in Northern Ireland in terms of conflict resolution is insider parcels. And there are quite a number of people who have been released from the prisons in Northern Ireland, both on the Republican and the Loyalist side, who have played a very, very positive role in terms of trying to bring peace to Ireland, North and South. And I think that we need to examine what those people have done and try to encourage them to actually continue to do that. They helped to deliver a ceasefire once, and I think that they can do it again. So it's important that we actually do build up those structures within our society, right through all of that, and make sure that they all connect at some stage or the other. But there are lots of problems around the term resolution and around why resolution can't happen. If we examine one of them, there's a conflict that exists in Sinn Féin's insistence that they are the government of Ireland, mandated in 1918, which was almost 80 years ago, when the world was a very different place and the British Empire was in place. Sinn Féin continually refused to recognise that the real British presence in Ireland is the Unionist people and not the British government. And I think some of the Sinn Féin people have started to learn that they need to deal with the Unionists. But unfortunately, when it comes to the bigger picture, and when negotiations are trying to happen, they continually leapfrog that community and try to go directly to the British government. And I think that that's a mistake because, whatever agreement's found, it's going to be found by all of the people in Northern Ireland. It will be by their agreement. And I think that nationally and internationally, there's a role for people to play. But I think that role is one of facilitation. And I think that the Americans have played this role of facilitation over the last couple of years impeccably. And when I talk about America, I talk about the administration and also corporate America. If we look at some of the roles that people have played, if we take a Kennedy School here, they have a Young Leaders Programme, which is, they work with Frank Costello, who's in the audience, and they bring young people from Northern Ireland, and they try to encourage them in terms of leadership and encourage them to be good leaders and show them good examples of that. So I think that's a very, very positive thing. We also have Boston Iron Ventures, which is linked up with Springboard, which is an international fund for iron venture. And it brings people from West Belfast, both the Shanklin Falls and also from Tala and Dublin, here to Boston, to try and improve their job prospects. And they send them out into Boston on job schemes. So I think those sorts of things are important. But obviously people like Ron Brown, the late Ron Brown and late Chuck Meisner, were people who recognised that if they were going to help Northern Ireland, they could help them through economics, and they continue to do that. In fact, I think that, I knew Chuck Meisner better than I knew Ron Brown, and I know that he did quite a lot of work on the ground. He visited some of the most deprived areas and always was interested in what was going on and kept Ron Brown informed about what needed to be done. They encouraged American companies to invest in Northern Ireland, and they also encouraged the governments to actually try and put on investment conferences where not only business people could go, but where community people could go. Because I think Chuck Meisner learned very early on that if people who were going to invest in Ireland were going to be convinced that the ceasefire was there, or that people weren't going to be killed or blown up, it was going to be done by ordinary people in the communities. It wasn't going to be done by the Industrial Development Board or by British ministers, but it would be done by people on the ground, because they would hear the real stories. And obviously the other person that who's an American and has been quite involved has been George Mitchell, who has chaired the talks. George has shown quite a lot of patience with us all at the talks, and he has done quite a lot to move the talks on. I think that his role has not been recognised to the full extent of what he has done, but he has played a very, very positive role along with his colleagues. I think some of the things, if we are going to transform our conflict, that need to be dealt with now and not wait until we have a settlement, is our education system. I think that we need to find a quality in our education system. And just earlier we were having a discussion. I think that it's important that we actually promote the idea of integrated education in Northern Ireland. The problem with integrated education is that it is opposed by the churches, and particularly the four main churches, and they have opposed this tooth and nail. But if we are going to get anywhere in Northern Ireland, I think that we have to start with the children, and we have to allow our children to be educated together, to learn together, to share the history, and also respect the diversity that exists. And I think that if we don't teach our children that early on, then we will have problems. But it's not the panacea for all our ills, because we still live in segregated communities, and I think it'll be quite a time before we'll be able to live in any other integrated type of communities, unless it's a middle class basis. But in terms of the people who are in conflict, in the main, it tends to be people from working class backgrounds, and it's highly unlikely that they're going to integrate in their housing at this point. But we do need to tackle the whole idea of integrated education. We also have a system in Northern Ireland where we have the government are telling us, that we should come together and we should get agreements and we should be moving the process on, and we still have them pumping £290 million a year into an education system which teaches our children separately. and also trains our teachers separately as well. If you're a Protestant teacher, you're taught in a separate training school from a Protestant or from Catholics. So that is separated as well, and I think whichever government comes into power after May, they need to take a serious look at this and look at how they can actually change that whole ethos of education and training teachers, and also integrating our children. Obviously, the other opportunity that exists at the moment is in terms of economic development. I think if we create jobs, it won't stop the violence, but it will go a long way to helping, I suppose, sustain whatever type of peace process that we have, or encouraging a peace process to grow. Because one of the problems is, irrespective of whether you're a Republican or a Loyalist, and you live in an area of high deprivation, the problem is that our young people are getting up in the morning, they have no work to go to, and they continually feel that they have no self-worth. And if we are going to change that, then we need to try and create those jobs, because it is important that we show people that we have some sort of pride in our country and in our communities, and that we want to try and drive the thing on in terms of being able to create jobs, put people into work, meaningful work, and it's another way of getting people to actually interact. One of the things about Northern Ireland is that whenever you're growing up in Northern Ireland, you're born in separate hospitals and you're buried in different graveyards, and people can go through their whole lives and not have any communication with somebody from a different religion. And that might sound strange to people here in the United States, but that's the way it is. And it tends to be, if you come from a low socioeconomic background and live in what essentially is a ghetto, then you could go through life without having meeting somebody of the opposite religion. The problem with this is that it creates all sorts of stereotypes, and it makes the position even harder whenever it comes to trying to transform or resolve that conflict. So therefore it's important that inward investment happens, and that young people are being trained for jobs, and that those jobs are fair and that they're equitable, and that people get jobs on their merit and not on their religious or political affiliations. It's important that that happens, and we must try and do something about that. I think that some of the expertise that exists in America for growing small companies can be used to help people in Northern Ireland. I think over 50% of the people employed by the private sector are employed by Northern Ireland companies. So it's important that we try to grow our Indigenous companies and don't rely on inward investment from multinationals. But we must also try and encourage any investment that's going to come from either North America or from Malaysia or wherever. And I think that we have to continue to do that, because it will play an important role in this whole transformation. I would want to sort of say that we are going to have questions and answers, and I'm quite sure that people would have quite a lot of questions that they will want answered. I have tried to give an outline of what the situation is in Northern Ireland and where we need to move to. I don't think that I have the answers of how we transform a conflict, and I don't think that anybody else has. I think that we have a lot of hard work ahead of us, and what we must do is carry out that work in a backdrop of peace. And all of this dialogue must be inclusive, and at the end of the day, the people of Northern Ireland must agree it. And once it's agreed, irrespective of whether my party, Sinn Féin, or any other party disagrees, if the majority of people say that's what they want, then we have to accept that. And we all have to hold our hands up and say that this is the democratic process. And sometimes we may not like what the democratic process throws up, but what we have to do is agree with it, because it's the only democratic process we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Like Billy, I'd like to thank those who are responsible for the invitation to this body. I noticed in the reception room that President Clinton spoke at this body once. I've been lucky enough to have had one conversation with President Clinton in my life, and that was in Belfast City Hall when he came there a short time ago. And as he shook my hand, I meant to say to the President that after the worst of days in Belfast, this is one of our best. What came out, though, was that after many good days in Belfast, this is one of our worst. And that the look on his face said that here is one of those people he's heard of who live in Belfast who are hostile to American involvement. I hope it makes some more sense tonight. Maybe some of you people in the audience, President Clinton is your political hero, but my political hero is actually the late Robert Kennedy. And in 1966, he said to a South African audience that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. And after the traumas of the last 25 years in the North, and after the particular anxieties of the last 2 or 3 years in the North, we understand what he meant about the difficulty, the peril, and the uncertainty. And then, interestingly, he added, "Yet this is the measure of the task of this generation, and the road is strewn with many dangers." And certainly in Northern Ireland, we understand what that means, because quite literally, over the next number of months, the road is strewn with many dangers, the marching roads of Northern Ireland, and that whatever I say tonight shouldn't deny or diminish the difficulties that we're going to face over the coming weeks and months, difficulties that certain people will exploit for their own narrow advantage against the interests of the wider community. And that whilst I will outline a strategy of some hope and a notion of some possibility in Northern Ireland, I do not wish to deny or diminish the possibility of an escalation or a conflict over coming times. I want to address, really, if you like, a number of audiences tonight. The first being the Republican audience, because it seems to me that in America, America has a love affair with Republicans. Maybe not in the White House, but certainly back in Ireland. And I want to make a number of comments about Republicans and what they are doing in the north of Ireland at the moment. Because, in my view, it is now self-evident and compellingly true that nobody believes in the advantage of war or believes that war will bring about change in our political conditions. You might remember a political slogan that Sinn Féin used a number of years ago, where they said very sinisterly that they intended to take power in Ireland with the Armalite in the ballot box, the Armalite in one hand and the ballot box in the other. In my view, Republicans themselves no longer believe either in that strategy or in the advantage of war. And that one of the great constraining elements on the IRA since they broke their ceasefire and denied the democratic right of the Irish people to self-determine their means of political struggle, one of the great constraining elements upon the IRA since that time has been the fact that their own people now reject and resist the use of violence in their name. Never mind the fact that the entire people of the island reject and resist the IRA's use of violence in the name of the Irish people. And that is one of the great strengths of our difficult political process at the moment. Because I live on the Falls Road, I live among Republicans. They are good and decent people. They aspire for themselves what we aspire for all of us: a right to a job, security, a home, and education. And that those people are being let down by the Republican leadership at this time, by the failure of the Republican leadership to return to the Irish people that which they most desire, and that's namely a ceasefire. Now, that argument is not an argument to exclude Sinn Féin or the Republican movement from involvement in the democratic process. I welcome it. I wish it. But until the Republican movement accept the wishes of the Irish people and accept the wishes of their own community, that they do not want to see a return to war, then they impose an exile upon themselves from full and equal involvement in the political process. The second audience I want to address is the British audience. And I want to say, first of all, that it is not acknowledged adequately that the British government has made some creative steps in respect of policy in the north of Ireland. Some of you who are political scientists and all of you who are politicians will know about the significance of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, the Downing Street Declaration, the framework document, and endless others communiques from the British and Irish government, where the British and Irish governments jointly together in an agreed strategy began to pursue political advance and peace in our country. And they have to be acknowledged, and that has to be applauded. But it also has to be said that the British government was not prepared for the IRA ceasefire, and then began to mismanage the ceasefire when it was in operation, and in particular positioned the issue of decommissioning in a way that was going to booby-trap the political process. And that decommissioning for Republicans is not about the handing over of weapons, it's actually about surrender to the British government. And Republicans, whatever I might feel about what they've done to our country over the last 25 years, will not surrender. And that what we must learn from that is that in a very short number of months, there's going to be a new British government. And that British government must prepare itself either for ceasefire or at least to move on issues that can advance the political process and the peace process. And what I would suggest to them, that in the early days after they come into power, in order to bring about the possibility of political advance, is that they first of all work in an agreed way with the Irish government, injecting three qualities into the political process: dynamic, direction, and deadlines. Because that will tell people that the political process is sustainable and works. And at the same time, the British government should take initiatives that which justice demand in any case, but which can build confidence in the political process on a wider basis. And in particular, they should do that in the 3 R's of Irish politics, which are repatriation, release, and repeal of repressive legislation. And that, in my view, that will be able to exploit that which exists within the wider community in the north at the moment, namely that there's no advantage to war, that there's no need for war, and that we want to get round the table. The third thing I want to talk about is actually about Billy Hutchinson, and to talk about what he represents as a representative figure in Northern Ireland society at the moment. If I ask people in this audience at the moment to put up their hands and say, who is Irish roots, who is Irish American, who is Irish, I would suspect quite a few of you would. But so would Billy Hutchinson. He would accept, and his wife Eileen would accept, that he is Irish. Now, he would do that not to deny the fact that he is British, that he's a loyalty to the British Crown, that he values the British Union, the fact that he values a British way of life, heritage, and values. But when people from his tradition can put their hand up and say that they too are Irish, then I think there's a cultural shift in our politics that is deep and is significant and is profound and is going to have a major impact. I'm sorry to quote Bobby Kennedy again, but that's all I ever do back home to the... And he also said in another speech that few men are willing to brave the disapproval of their fellows, the censure of their colleagues, the wrath of their society. Moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. Yet it is the one essential vital quality for those who seek to change a world that yields most painfully to change. As you heard, Billy Hutchinson previously used physical bravery to make a political statement in our country. But it is his moral bravery and the bravery of loyalists like him, and bravery also of endless numbers of unionists in our community, that can bring about change in our society that yields most painfully change. Because Billy Hutchinson and Eileen Hutchinson would be the first to say that they are only representative of people in the unionist community, the unionist churches, and the unionist commercial life of our country, who are of that mind, who are prepared to use the word of your president, take risks for peace. And that whilst you this summer will see headlines that define the unionist people in a very narrow and abusive way, as they insist to trample the rights of the nationalist people by walking down streets where they are not welcome, remember that Billy Hutchinson and people like him exist, and that they actually speak about that which is emerging within the unionist community, namely a community that is prepared to accept change, is prepared to accommodate nationalists on the basis of equality, and will go into change even if they're not enthusiastic about some of the changes that will come. The fourth issue I want to talk about is about you, is about America and about Americans, and about what your role, in my view, should be in our society at the moment. The most famous quote, I think, of your president since he was elected 4 and a bit years ago was what he said in Belfast when he said, "Take risks for peace," that America will stand by those who take risks for peace. And we know what that means in Belfast. We know that when Chuck Meisner and Ron Brown and John Cullinane and Frank Costello and Governor Weld and Joe Kennedy come, they come to stand with us and to take risks for peace. And there is going to be a time in the very near future when, in my view, America will have to take risks for peace in our country. And they will have to do it by public exhortation and private persuasion. And they'll know when the time comes. And the governments will know when that time comes. But because of the standing you have in our country, and because that standing is seen to be impartial and does not favour one over the other, then when you've consolidated your position on Ireland, as it seems to me your government is doing at the moment, a time will come when you'll have to do a bit more. When you will have to inspire us to take those risks for peace necessary in order to bring about the peace. And that will come and come at the appropriate time. The second matter that you have to continue is that you have to continue to assist us on the economic front on 2 levels. The first, and really a one that's not fully understood in America, is to assist us in Ireland economically position ourselves and our own companies and our own businesses to avail of the opportunities both within the island, within the islands, within the European Union, and within America. Because what people like John Cullinane and Frank Costello have indicated to us is how what we have, our skills base, our manufacturing base, the quality of our life, the quality of our young people and the education system, how that should actually be much more better presented and positioned in order to avail much more effectively of the economic opportunities that exist for our own companies back home, as well as position us to attract the companies from America and elsewhere that can bring about a sustainable economy. Because, as Billy and myself know, given the level of disadvantage that exists in the Falls and the Shankill, it is economic inequality and economic disadvantage that fuels those who feel they don't have a stake in society and who want to kick back, either kick back at the nationalists who are getting all the jobs, or kick back at the British state who's not giving us any jobs. And in that way, economic diplomacy has a very real and intimate political effect. I know I'm going to finish soon, so we don't have to panic. The final thing I want to say is also, in my view, a message of some hope. And that is about the people who we are. Like, you know about the headlines and about the trauma and about the bombs and the killings and the bullets. And that's understandable, because that's the nature of our media. They will concentrate upon the crisis rather than concentrate upon the truth. And in fact, it's appropriate that you know about our crisis, that you know about how the spilling of blood on the brain and on the memory of a nation, as a South African poet once said, has traumatized and affected us. But it doesn't tell you about who we are and about what we have done both at home and abroad. It doesn't tell you that Belfast is not a Bosnia. And the reason it's not a Bosnia is because of the defiance and dignity of all its citizens who refused to not stand up against the forces of political and paramilitary extremism, and about the depth of character and courage that that took day in and day out when it was very easy to give up. It also doesn't tell you about what we have done to contribute to the world. Most of you, or quite a few of you, would have come here in a car tonight. What you won't know is that the first tower was designed and built by a man called John Dunlop in May Street in Belfast in 1887. That the ABS braking that you might have in some of your more expensive cars, the students won't have that obviously, was designed and was previously known as the FF braking, named after Harry Ferguson, the Ferguson formula, who was a designer who lived outside Belfast. What you probably don't know is that your vertical takeoff jets and the ejector seats in those jets that you use in various adventures around the world were designed, unfortunately, in Belfast. And that what you won't know is that the ropes that your Navy used in your dockyards here in Boston when you had them were built and designed in Belfast. That's what we have contributed historically and traditionally to the economy of the world. And I haven't even talked yet about what our people have done, those who are forced and who choose to come to your country, what we have done as Irish people, north and south, in contributing to the building of America. And that when you see the headlines over the summer, remember about what we have done, both in protecting the real peace process, which was a process that refused our country entering the civil war over 25 years, and the economic and other contributions that we've made. I want to conclude, because I'm an Irishman, I have to tell a story. And I hear that this story is true. And the story goes that years ago, the warriors of Ireland, because we are, as you might have gathered, a warrior nation, gathered to pick a new king. And after much deliberation, they chose Brian Boru. And as the Irish are great talkers, they talked late into the night. And they talked about what was the most wonderful noise, or most wonderful sound in the world. One person suggested that it was the sound of a skylark in the fields in the morning. Another person suggested it was a young woman talking about her first love. The warriors were, after all, a very romantic people. But after talking about it for many hours, and typical of the Irish people, they couldn't agree. So they went off to Brian Boru and they asked Brian Boru, what do you think is the most beautiful sound in the world? And he said, listen, that is the most beautiful sound in the world. The warriors, obviously being confused, didn't understand, and asked Boru, what do you mean? And he said, listen closely and hear the sound of men and women going about their business in peace and building prosperity. That is the most beautiful sound in the world. In the fall of '94, that was the beautiful sound we had in Belfast. And that is the beautiful sound we will hear again.
We have a few ground rules for asking questions this evening. The first and the most important is, if you'd like to ask a question, I'm afraid I must ask you to line up at one of these two microphones. I realize that's awkward for those of you who are upstairs, but we can't possibly see you, so if you could come down and line up the microphones, we would love to entertain your questions. Two other ground rules. We would hope that you would frame a question rather than make a comment to get most out of the evening. And secondly, we would like you to identify yourself prior to asking your question. Yes, sir.
I'm Ned Tebbett, and I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School here. And I'm a you hear me all right? I have a loud voice. I'm a descendant of Daniel O'Connell, who is probably the most distinguished Irish Catholic person serving 25 years in the British Parliament. O'Connell advocated having Ireland be part of Great Britain, part of the Parliament, and have a form of home rule. Is there a possible political compromise today that would involve that concept?
Sorry. You might be interested to know that just last week, a bust of Daniel O'Donnell was erected in my old school in Belfast, St. Malachy's College. And it's the first time, I think, for maybe 100 years, that an Irish man of his significance in our country has been acknowledged in Belfast in that way. And I hope that as a descendant of Daniel O'Connell, you might particularly appreciate that. As for your proposal, if the Irish people, by referendum, choose any political outcome, then as an Irish Democrat, I would have to accept that outcome. Whatever political model that they might choose, I will have to live with, because if that's endorsed by a majority of the people, then that's what we will have to accept, as Billy outlined. I don't think that that is a political model that is high on anybody's agenda at the moment. Maybe I'll be surprised when we get into substantive negotiations. And let's hear the argument, if there is an argument. What is more important, though, as an Irish nationalist, is that in any political settlement, we have to acknowledge, as Irish nationalists, that which those who define themselves as unionists respect and value. That we, as Irish nationalists, have to respect the fact that they value the British monarchy, that unionists value the British Union, that the unionists value being called British, and that the unionists value that British way of life, heritage and values. And that I would suggest that that is the real challenge to Irish nationalists. Are we, at this end of this century, generous and creative enough to accommodate on a basis of equality those values which I've just outlined, which unionists value above all else? And that is there a political model that we can design that gives expression to that?
No, I wouldn't say that as the suggestion that you're making as being a model that would probably come out of any talks in Northern Ireland. I think if the Republic are going to go into anything, I mean, it's going to be sort of fuller into the economic union in Europe, and I think that's where their future probably lies, rather than in some sort of restructuring of the British Isles. But I do believe that because of the outcome that is possible in Northern Ireland, there will be a different relationship between the Republic of Ireland and the rest of the British Isles. But I don't think it will be one of sovereignty. I think there will be a working relationship where there's agreements across a number of sectors and issues. But I couldn't actually see it being coming back into the British Commonwealth.
Thank you. Frank Costello.
Frank Costello, my question is to both of you. I was just in Belfast recently, and Alex, you mentioned the winds of change in the unionist community, certainly reflected by Billy Hutchinson. But to both of you, while I was there, I saw other winds of change in the Belfast newsletter, a staunchly unionist paper, and also Ken McGuinness, unionist MP, staunchly unionist, both recommending that there be an apology for Bloody Sunday, of the killing of 14 unarmed civil rights marchers in Derry 25 years ago. Would it mark a fresh start? Would it be constructive the next British government, whether Tory or Labour, would be willing to take that up?
Well, yes. You know, what was it that somebody once said? That pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, and in our own time comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. I think that the pain that people have suffered over the generations in Northern Ireland has actually now begun to become wisdom, and that for a man who's made many unwise statements, Ken McGuinness's statement, beginning to indicate that what happened on Bloody Sunday was the killing of innocent, unarmed people, was a statement of some significance. And that the more people like that make those statements, then the more people begin to say that the harm done one to the other and one community to the other is acknowledged, and in the acknowledging of the damage done, then we can begin to get on with the rest of our lives. The British government should many years ago have acknowledged what they did through their army on the streets of Derry on Bloody Sunday, and that we all know in our community and beyond our community what happened on that day, on that Sunday in Derry, and that if the British government admits to what happened and launches a full investigation into what happened and begins to purge the pain of what happened, it will be very welcome, but it'll be long overdue.
Yeah, I think that there is a wind of change, particularly in the newsletter. It's been bought over by the Daily Mirror. So there is going to be changes in that paper, I would imagine. In terms of people apologising, I think that, I think that there's a recognition, particularly from people in my party and myself, that, we have suffered at the hands of the British government as well in terms of people being killed. My own cousin was actually shot by the same regiment that was involved in Bloody Sunday and later died from his wounds. But, I think we get into this whole issue of people apologising and not apologising. And even though the Loyalists apologised for the deaths of all the innocent people in '94, we were still criticised for it because people says, well, they didn't really mean it anyway. And I'm not sure whether people are going to accept any apologies. I think what we need to do is that, we need to accept that there was wrongs done in the past, and we need to get on with it. Otherwise, we're going to be asking everybody in the country to say, I apologise for A, B, and C. We'll be looking the IRA to apologise for Enniskillen and for bloody Friday and for all the missing, and the Loyalists to do the same. And I think we have to be very, very careful. But there is an onus on people to recognise and to admit that they have been involved in wrongs in the past. And I think that's up to all of us who have been involved in that, to actually come out and be honest and say it. But, it hasn't happened. And I don't think it will happen quite quickly. Maybe there's lessons to learn from what's happening in the South African process. And we maybe need to examine that. But I don't think that if people continue to sort of push for apologies, that we move the process on. But I think it's up to individuals, whether they're governments or organisations, they actually do it in some way and have it over and done with, rather than going through a whole list of apologies that have to be made.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is David Gray. I'm a student at the Kennedy School and also at the law school. I believe Mr. Atwood, the quote from Aeschylus about wisdom, again, comes as Bobby Kennedy's, again, his favorite poem. My question is twofold. First, having to do with peacekeeping forces, and I'm wondering, you refer to Northern Ireland as no Bosnia. I wonder, as the international community plays some role, a large role there, I'm wondering if there's any talk or any possibility of the United Nations playing any role, I guess to both of you, in Northern Ireland. And furthermore, if the British forces there have ever taken upon themselves or have any potential or have ever had any claim to being some sort of neutral peacekeeping force between paramilitary groups on both sides. And then secondly, in reference to the repressive legislation, if there's any hope that you think the EPA or any of the type of criminal procedure or anything which seems particularly, I think Mr. Atwood would say particularly repressive, has any chance to be changed in the next administration?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the big differences over the last 20 or 25 years is that the problem has become internationalized, and that as a consequence has made some people escalate the conflict because they were getting an international focus on the conflict, and other people to use international pressure to bring about some change in the political conditions in Northern Ireland. You know, one example, the United Nations is involved in Northern Ireland. Every year it does a report on human rights in Northern Ireland, and that report, as I'm sure the representative of the British government will concur, is usually embarrassing to the British government in relation to its treatment of the citizens of Northern Ireland, whether it's arrest, detention, search, the court system, the use of weapons that kill and maim. And therefore, that internationalising of the problem has been very important. Similarly, the internationalising of the economic debate, the pressure brought via America in many ways has ensured that the British government has felt obliged to bring about equality legislation that is much more focused and effective than it might otherwise have been. So the problem is internationalised, and in fact that is one of the reasons why there are more opportunities both to expose what's going on and to begin to resolve what's happened. I don't think that bringing in an international peacekeeping force is justified in terms of the security situation, but helpful in terms of the political situation. In respect of the repeal of oppressive legislation, I don't hold out much hope, because even if there's a Labour government, the Labour government only last week again supported in effect the reintroduction for a year of legislation that is deemed to be the most draconian in Western Europe in relation to the movements of people between Britain and Ireland, and therefore repeal at this time doesn't seem to be high on any British government's agenda, least of all the likely next British government.
Yeah, I think the internationalising of the situation has happened, and I think it would sort of it wouldn't improve the situation by bringing in troops from the United Nations. I think what we need to do is that we need to examine the laws that are there, and also examine, I suppose, what we have got in terms of the British Army or the RUC. And I think that there's, quite a lot of issues there about how we actually deal with this. But until, we get an IRA ceasefire, nobody is going to be even interested in talking about this. I think Alex is right. I think that there was 14 people out of 600 and odd last week voted to do away with the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And I think it needs to be, I need to actually sort of say this, we tend to hear a lot about miscarriages of justice against Republicans, and we tend to hear that all this legislation is aimed at them. It isn't. It's aimed at everybody. I mean, I have a problem moving about sort of England or Scotland. I continually get stopped by police at airports and also at docks and questioned about my movements. So it isn't just for sort of members of Sinn Féin. In fact, some members of Sinn Féin can move about the United Kingdom far more easily than I can, and I claim to be a British citizen. They don't seem to get as much hassle as I do when I go to these places. So I think that needs to be sort of pointed out, that this legislation is against everybody who would be involved in any sort of, or have any sort of connections with any of those organisations. So it is important that we repeal all that, but at the moment it isn't going to happen while there's an IRA assaults going on, and we need to get back to a ceasefire, and then we need to get rid of all that, because our answer, or what we need to ask then, is why do you need this legislation if there's no forms of terrorism going on anywhere in the United Kingdom? So I mean, they will probably say that they need to keep it the fight against Islamic fundamentalism or something, but I mean, they won't need it against people who are coming from Northern Ireland or the Republic.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Pat Marr, and I'm with a group called Peace Watch Ireland that works with grassroots activists in the North on human rights and justice issues. And in that context, I'd be interested in hearing both your comments on a few issues. One is the incarceration and denial of bail to Roisin McAlliskey. The second is the right to march issue, and particularly the report of the North Commission. And lastly, how you both may expect to protect labor rights and human rights in the globalizing of trade in the North. Around the world, the globalization of the economy certainly hasn't meant the protection of human rights. So I'd love your comments on those three things. Thank you.
I'm going to start this time. So you start it. And in terms of Roisin McAlliskey, or anybody else who's held in prisons, I think that we need to look at these issues and sort of take them from a human rights point of view. And there's no denying that what's going on with Roisin McAlliskey isn't probably the right way that she should be treated. What I would like to say is that there are other people who have been getting treated even worse, and there's a loyalist ceasefire. And I think that we need to examine that as well. And I would, sort of ask people who are involved in human rights in America to start looking at what's happening to loyalists. We've had a ceasefire for over 20 odd months, and we have a person in prison who's suffered a brain hemorrhage. His daughter committed suicide, and he was refused. They refused to allow him from the prison to go to his daughter's funeral, and they've also refused to release him. We have seen people who have been moved from a jurisdiction in the United Kingdom, who are IRA people, and moved into the Republic because they've been sick and to be closer to their families, and we can't get people released. So I think that there are still a lot of things wrong, and I think that the British government continually shoot themselves in the foot over human rights issues. But I think that it needs to be understood, because I think that the message goes out around the world that this is against Irish prisoners. It's against all the prisoners. And I think that one of the problems is that the Tory government were elected in terms of law and order, and Howard, who's the Home Secretary, has been very, very tough on prisoners, and not just on political prisoners, but also on what they call ordinary decent criminals. And I think that we have to look at it in that context. That's not justifying what's happening to Roisin McAlliskey. I don't think that she should be being treated the way she is, but I do think that I need to make a point that there are other people who are being treated even worse than her, and have been for the last number of years, and they need to be rectified as well. In terms of marching, I think that it's an issue of civil rights. I don't think that the North Commission goes far enough to deal with it. I think that the North Commission is okay if we can reach some form of agreement between the communities and those people who are trying to march. But we would say that it has to be a civil rights issue, and it shouldn't be on the issue of orange parades. It should be on the issue of parading for human rights. Well, that's a Sinn Féin parade, while it's a parade for gay rights, or while it's a parade for unemployed, for people who are long-term unemployed, we should be treating parades as people's human rights to do that, and their civil right. And we need to actually examine that. We also need some sort of legislation which is built into a tribunal or a court that can take a decision and be consistent in that decision, and not change from one parade to the other. And I think that the only way to do that is to have legislation and to set up a tribunal or a court to deal with it. I think it's unacceptable at the moment to leave it up to a senior police officer or the chief constable to decide whether there's going to be greater public disorder if a parade goes ahead or not. And that's the way it works. So it's whoever can rent the biggest crowd. And I'd have to say too, what concerns me about the whole parades issue is that people in Northern Ireland will travel 100 miles to be insulted. And unless we change people's attitudes, in terms of having respect for that diversity, then we aren't going to solve our problems.
Yeah, in relation to Roisin McAlliskey, who is being held in a London prison, awaiting extradition or possible extradition to Germany for alleged IRA activity. In my view, a political decision was taken by the British government to try to break Roisin McAlliskey's will, to break her will and for her to accept extradition. And that as a consequence of that, there was a particularly cruel and vicious attempt to deny her what would be considered as reasonable standards while it's been held in custody. Now, the situation is alleviated a little, but this girl is over 7 months pregnant and has been subjected to the denial of rights that would be accepted in many jurisdictions around the world. And that what should happen is that if the German authorities, as they appear, believe that she can be released pending this extradition hearing, then she should be released, and that she should be allowed to have her child in the safety of a hospital. In relation to the marches issue and the proposals of a North Commission, which the government sponsored in order to bring about a resolution of the marches issue, as soon as that commission announced proposals, the British government was perceived by many people to bin those proposals, in that they then decided that they would have a further period of consultation during which to see if they could get a consensus about the marching. What we need, though, on the marching issue is that residents, other interested parties, and a marching order, either through direct or indirect dialogue, achieve a consensus about what marches, if any, should go down what road at what time. That's what we need. And that we need a success of dialogue of that nature in Dunloy or the Ormer Road or other marching conflict zones in order to set a standard by which all other marching disputes could be judged. And if we could have that success, then I think there's a potential to moderate the damage that awaits us over the summer months. But what I am worried about is that there are political forces at play who see the marching issue at this time, and in particular see the potential of an agreement on the marching issue this time as damaging to their narrow political interests, and that there are booby traps being laid by those who might see that issue in that way at this very moment. And finally, in respect to the issue about labour and human rights, that's a very vast question, except to answer in this way. When the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation was set up by the Irish government after the IRA ceasefire of 1994, at the very time when the Forum was suspended because of the IRA's return to war, there were 2 draft reports awaiting approval by the Forum. Those draft reports were on economic, social, political, and minority rights, and were a blueprint about where Ireland should go in the next century in relation to protection of all range of rights, including the rights of communities, which is an area of law that's only developing internationally at this time. And that, given the nature of this particular body, I would commend those documents to the JFK Institute as being a blueprint for other jurisdictions as well.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Sarah Denford. I'm an undergraduate in the government department. My question is regarding Sean O'Callaghan, the IRA member and police informant, and his recent comments regarding the denunciation of IRA violence, and also somewhat denunciation about Irish American romanticism of IRA violence. And I'm wondering what the reaction has been in Northern Ireland about that.
Well, I think reaction to his comments would be varied, and I think what I would say is that, I think he has a lot of points that he makes, but I think that he tries to make them in the wrong way. I think the last thing we need to do is to demonize people. I think we've just come out of 27 years of demonizing people. And what we want to do is not marginalize people further, but to bring them in. And you don't do it by doing the sort of, or behaving the way he's doing. I think I am diametrically opposed to the IRA and what Sinn Féin's trying to achieve, but I recognise that they have to play their part, and I have to allow them to play that part. And I also recognise that there are people who would try to demonise me because of where I come from. And I think that we have to move on from that and try to encourage people from those sorts of backgrounds to actually move towards non-violence. It's difficult because people do have a notion of America, and I think that, America do play a key role in terms of stopping the IRA achieving what they want to achieve. I mean, I spoke at one of the summer schools in the Republic in '95, before the IRA broke our ceasefire, and there's no question of it. I mean, about the romanticism that comes from America, particularly. I think that Alex alluded to it in his speech about people who see this Republican fight. I can understand that people who came to America because of the famine or because of whatever else felt that they were forced out of Ireland by the British, and they take on that attitude. But I do think that that one of the things that the Americans did was that they exported from America the whole notion of violent republicanism. And that's why we have an IRA. And I think that, the Americans are now putting that right. They will stop the money and they will stop the guns coming to the IRA if the IRA are continuing to, work against the rest of the community, not only in Northern Ireland, but in the whole of Ireland and in the British Isles. So I can understand, what he is saying, but at the same time, I don't think that his approach is the right one. We need to embrace people and bring them in and make it inclusive rather than trying to demonize them. And, I just think that his comments at this time are the wrong ones. I made a point, I think it was to John Cullinan earlier when I was talking to him. I was saying that, some of the comments that he makes in terms of doing all this, he says that the IRA will only call a ceasefire, they're all dangerous people, and, they call a ceasefire its tactics. My argument to that is, what's new? Should we know all that? But the point is, if these people stop killing people, it doesn't matter what the reason is. The point is that all of those other people who are involved in the political process have all different ideas about why they will do this, and they will all build up their arguments to tackle Sinn Féin, who are the IRA's political representatives. So I won't worry. All I would be concerned about is that the IRA call their ceasefire, and I know who they are and what they are and all the dangers, but I'm quite prepared that they bring it all to the table in a peaceful means and they leave the guns outside. And I think that that's what we have to do.
Briefly, I think that more important than who said what is there any validity in what was said? Because there would be people back home, people who have gone far down the road with Republicans, who might concur with the views that O'Callaghan suggested, and that whatever lack of credibility he may or may not have, there are issues there that can't be dismissed merely by dismissing the man, and which need to be addressed seriously. Now, I'm one of those people who believe that at a certain time, the Republican leadership believed that they could bring about more advantage through the political process than military actions, and that a strategy was designed, and they became convinced that there was validity in that argument. The problem was that whilst that represented the leadership of the Republican movement, and whilst that was very broadly supported on the ground, there was an element within the IRA who didn't agree with the timing of the first ceasefire or its means of delivery, and looked for the opportunity to break it. And the British government, through some of their actions, and through actions of other people as well, because none of us are without blame, created the opportunity for those who were a minority within the IRA, and who certainly didn't reflect the majority of Republicans, to get critical mass to break it. And that's what happened. And if that is what happened, in my view, then the conspiracy theory that Sean O'Callaghan outlines may lack some validity.
Thank you. We clearly have far more questioners than we have time for questions, so I'm going to take one last question over here, and then I would ask anyone else if they wouldn't mind coming forward afterwards and asking the question. So last question here, please.
Hi, I'm Beth Parkhurst from Reaching Common Ground. Mr. Atwood, you didn't need to tell me that Mr. Hutchinson is Irish because he's the absolute image of my brother.
A lot of people say that. Well, he did say that earlier. I honestly did.
My question is about the significant difference between being Irish and being Irish American. And it would take too long to make a big statement about that, but we're all aware of the political and the political implications of it. What I would like to ask you both is, if the difference between you as Irish men and me as an Irish American woman is any different, is in any way different from the difference between you and a Catholic Irish American.
So you wouldn't repeat that?
Sure. Like, I am very often reminded of the fact that, yes, we guys are all Irish Americans, and we have to remember that, like, we're not like Irish. So, yes, there is a difference. What I'm asking you is, if the difference that exists between you and me, with all of its political ramifications, which would take too long to talk about now, but we all know what we're talking about, are somehow in any way that you can identify different between the difference that would exist between you and a Catholic Irish American.
Well, I think first of all there's an immense debate going on in Ireland about what it is to be Irish. It's very interesting that somebody was saying last night that Irish people, and this is reflected in the promotion of Irish dancing, the Irish language, the river dance phenomenon, that Irish people are again comfortable with things that were being rejected by generations of Irishmen previously. That this sort of Gaelic dancing, cultural expression has now become enlivened and enriched, when only 2 or 3 generations ago it was being sidelined and being dismissed. And I think that what that reflects is that there's a great debate going on about what it is to be Irish, and that as a consequence the Irish are becoming much more confident and assertive, both about their identity, about their role in the European Union, how they conduct their own affairs, their relationships with the rest of the world. And that I don't know how that's going to pan out. I don't even know if I'm answering your question, but but what I'm trying to do is suggest to you that whatever way Irish people relate to Irish in America, whether they're male or female, whatever religion they might have, is in a process of change, because the Irish people are in a process of change, a process most reflected in the election of Mary Robinson, who announced today that she wasn't going to stand for re-election in November this year. But what she defined was a confident Ireland that was inclusive of women, of travellers, of community groups, of people who previously were not part of the power structures within our society. And that I think that when you go back to Ireland and really look at what's going on, this introspective, defensive, anti-British and land-centred people is a thing of the past. And that in the south of Ireland, that's where I'm talking about, you have this very great revival and redefinition of what it is to be Irish in the modern world. I don't know if that answers your question, was the best I can do.
I guess the answer is that you perceive me as Irish American, and my religion is irrelevant to you in who I am. Mr. Hutchinson.
Yeah,
I'll ask you this.
I don't see. Yeah.
We're this bunch of Irish Americans, and is your relationship to us, is your whatever theoretical relationship you'd have with me at all different from the relationship that political whatever that you'd have with the Catholic Irish American woman?
No, I think it, when I come to America and I meet with people who are Irish, I don't ask them what their religion is. Somebody said to me today that there's 44 million Irish Americans, and they say that quite a lot of them.
Nephew yesterday.
Right, and that's what they say. But somebody said to me today that something like 18 million of them are actually people who are from Protestant from the Protestant religion. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I mean, I wouldn't, ask somebody were they an Irish Catholic American. I mean, all I'm interested in is that they're Irish Americans, that they have some commitment to Ireland because they came from north or south, and I think that that's, the relationship that I have with them, whether they're male or female. It doesn't matter about their religion. I think that what matters is that they are committed to the principle of consent, and that they, if they're Irish nationalists and they want to see United Ireland, all I'm interested in is that they're committed to that principle of consent, and that they're not going to support violence to achieve that end. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I think that, Alex said early on in the speech about what people from Ireland have contributed to this country, and we've seen, and we continually see what people are doing. And I think that quite a lot of people from Northern Ireland who came from Protestant stock actually came here and achieved quite a lot. And, I think that my own family, my mother is a Grant and claims that she was related to Ulysses Grant, and my wife's mother was a McKinley and claims that she was connected to the McKinleys. So I think as a Protestant family we've done quite well for America. And
Got any Jacksons in your family?
no, well, I'm here for payback time. I've give yous all this. I hope that yous are going to give us. But I mean, no, religion's irrelevant to me. I'm not interested in whether somebody's Catholic or whether they're Protestant. And back home, I'm not interested why people are Catholic or Protestant. I'm interested in their politics in terms of what they're trying to achieve. And if their politics is the same as mine, that's all I'm interested in. I think that, what I want to do is build a pluralist society for the future. And, I don't have any time for asking people their religion. And people continually ask me my religion. I happen to be born into the Protestant community, but my religion doesn't mean anything to me in that sense. My politics is stronger, and I have more sense of that. So I'm not interested in people's religion. I'm interested in what they're committed to. And if they're committed to the same things as me, that's what attracts me to them.
I think that's an appropriate note on which to draw the evening to an end. I would like to thank in particular Billy Hutchinson for coming, for the courage to come and talk to what he could well have expected to be an unfriendly audience, and for bringing us a perspective which is not often heard in this country and still less in this town. I'd also like to thank Alex Atwood. I think in the eloquence of his exposition, he demonstrated that he has learned more from Bobby Kennedy than the ideas he articulated. And thank the Forum for the opportunity to put on this event. And thank you all for coming. Oh, it was great.
Thank you.
That is nice.